And with this battery of the bishop and the queen, and also the threat of knight f2, white resigned. What a game!
This is the top 10 of Magician Naroditsky's most brilliant moves. Number 10.
Take a moment for yourself to understand which move you would make to break through. Well, Naroditsky took on c4 with a knight, black took back, and the rook slides in to b5. And you can see that the queen is boxed in at a6, doesn't have any squares to go to. So, bishop c4, you see the X-ray attack, knight a5, bishop slides back, a brilliant quiet move, and if the bishop takes, you take back with the pawn, and you win the queen. That's not how it ended. Black went back with the king, and Naroditsky broke through the middle of the board and managed to have a lot of open lines. And this is how he eventually won the game.
Now, number 9.
I'm Mr. X, and together with my assistant Barry,
Well, hi.
we will take you through your journey to become a better chess player. From beginner to expert level, we're here to assist you.
In this position, Naroditsky played the quiet move c3, because if black would take, then this would happen. Eventually the knight would drop off, and the queen for the two rooks, and this is a better position for white. So instead, black went for king h8. Now white lines up the queen with the king, and if you would take now, results in a similar structure, but now it would be fine actually. Instead, black went for d5, opening up the center, which is not a good move, because now Naroditsky can break with g5. And bishop takes would have been the best move here. Instead, black went for knight takes f5. Naroditsky takes back. Bishop takes f5. Now taking on f6. And here the white knight finds a beautiful square, attacking the queen, also having this square under attack. Fixing the knight. Such a beautiful knight. The pawn drops, but now an amazing move for white. Rook takes g6. Yes. And if black would take the queen, then it's actually checkmate in 2 moves. And checkmate. Beautiful. How the knight and the rook collaborate here. Instead, black went rook takes b2, king in the corner, and now black thinks it has a smart sequence of moves with queen takes the knight and the rook, but the bishop simply hangs, and this is how Naroditsky won the game.
8.
Here Naroditsky plays against Jospin, and after h5, Naroditsky simply takes the pawn, because if you would take it back, then there's a check here, which is winning for white. Instead, black plays g6, bishop g4, queen e7, waiting for another beautiful move, because after knight h6, Naroditsky simply takes on e6 with the bishop. Yes, the pawn was hanging. Why? Well, if you take back with the queen, then you can take the knight here. If you take back, then you win the queen with a nice fork. And after rook f5, you can simply slide your queen back to d3 into this nice position for white with 2 pawns up.
7. This is my favorite.
And what about this game? 2 sacrifices in one game, in one sequence. There we go. After rook d2 by Naroditsky's opponent, Naroditsky sacrifices his knight on e4. Taking back, he simply takes with the rook, because if you would take back with the bishop. So that's not an option. Therefore, The king slides to the side and Naroditsky actually takes on f4, another sacrifice in the same game. And after takes, queen f6. The king is undefended. Taking with check, the king has to drop back, putting the rook on the e3 square, queen f2, threatening the rook, and after rook d1, white can simply take the rook. If you would take back, then the rook slides in to g3, winning the queen. And as Naroditsky's opponent played, if you would play knight d1, then there is a check on the back rank, and white actually allowed Naroditsky to checkmate him, because when you take the rook, there's a checkmate on g2. Stunning game.
6. I'm nervous. He?
Personally, I don't think this is one of the actually most beautiful games of Naroditsky, but because it's what allowed him to win from Magnus Carlsen, because his game is against Magnus Carlsen, we have to see it. So in this position, Naroditsky takes the knight. It's a very common sacrifice also in the Najdorf positions. White takes back, and there's a check on a2. King slides to d2, and Naroditsky takes on c3. If the king would take back, which of course Magnus didn't do, then there's a checkmate on b4. Beautiful. Instead, Magnus went back with the queen, and the game continued. But Naroditsky went on to convert his game and won his game against Magnus Carlsen. A big applause.
When he's playing chess, he feels fly, see him going. Number 5. Getting there.
King e8, the bishop drops in, and here we see a nice fork on the queen. That's what happened. Naroditsky took the queen, and yet, because this is important, also another knight, and black resigned. I think this is a stunning game, because in this position, white went to c2. Do you see the pin here? Well, that's what Naroditsky saw as well. So he simply sacrifices the bishop. Why not? Takes back, and then sacrifice a rook. Because one bishop is not enough. If you would take back, then there's a nice fork and you win the queen. So that's not what white did. Instead, white went back to b1. Here Naroditsky played queen e7, protecting the rook. And after a4, Naroditsky decides to sacrifice another piece. That would be the third piece. White didn't take, but if white would have taken, then it would have been a check and a checkmate in 2 moves. Instead, white played queen d5, and after playing the knight here, rook to a2, Naroditsky simply takes on c3, and after rook d1 and rook c5, queen b3, the knight goes back, attacking the queen. White takes the rook, black takes back, and Naroditsky won this game.
Number 4.
We've already seen a game with 3 sacrifices. Well, here's another one, because 1 is not enough. Bishop h3, that's sacrifice number 1. White takes back, and rook takes e3, another sacrifice, completely destroying white's king's position. White takes back, and there's a check on g3. White goes to the corner, there's a pawn, another check. White goes back, hoping for a draw. That's not what Naroditsky has in mind, and brings the rook into the game via e8. And then he simply gives away his rook. Why? Because if it goes here, then white will simply go checkmate. White takes the rook, and now this knight is simply beautiful. How is white going to protect from this checkmate? Well, after rook f1, you can simply slide in the bishop, and with this battery of the bishop and the queen, and also the threat of knight f2, white resigned. What a game!
Number 3.
In this game, Naroditsky played against Andrew Tang, and he decides to sacrifice his knight for starters. White takes back and gives a check, and has a beautiful diagonal. If the king would go to a1, then there's a beautiful move. You simply take the a3 pawn, and if you would take the queen, so this is a queen sacrifice, then there's a checkmate on b2. Or like this. Instead, Tang places knight to c3, and of course Naroditsky sacks another piece, and this time the rook for the bishop. Takes back, check, the king takes back, and you see these bishops, the queen, perhaps the rook, you can bring it into the game. This game is all over already. And indeed, with knight d7, with the check, king slides to c2, and here a beautiful check if I would take. Then there's a beautiful fork on c4, forking the king and the queen. Instead, Tang goes to c1, and now Naroditsky sets up this beautiful X-ray attack on the king. The rook goes forward, and Naroditsky takes the knight with check. The king has to go to d1, and in the corner of the board, Naroditsky gives a final check and actually wins the rook in the corner of the board. What a game. Simply stunning by Magician Naroditsky. What do you think, Barry?
What an absolute genius, Mr. X. Does Magician Naroditsky also have a magic wand like I have? Number 2. Woohoo!
In this game, Magician Naroditsky shows his qualities yet another time. Because after bishop b7 by his opponent, he simply takes the pawn on e6. Who would do that? Now let's check what would happen if black would take back the rook with the pawn. It's not what happened in the game. You would take the pawn with the knight, attacking the queen, and if the queen comes forward, you have a checkmate. What a move. So instead, black went with his king to f8, and here the beautiful, brilliant, quiet move, queen e2, bringing the queen into the game. And if you would take, then you have a nice fork on the queen. So instead, black played c5, but here Naroditsky sacrifices yet another piece on f7, takes back, and Naroditsky doesn't really like his pieces because he sacrifices another piece, the rook. Black took back on e7. Now the knight slides in to g5, and if the king would go to g8, then there's a check on e6, and checkmate here. King f6 is game over in one move, so there's one square left. That's also where black went to. King e8, the bishop drops in, and here we see a nice fork on the queen. That's what happened. Naroditsky took the queen, and yet, because this is important, also another knight, and black resigned.
And last, number 1, land in sight.
And personally, I think this is the most beautiful game of Magician Naroditsky. After king a1 by white, he simply takes the pawn on c3. Do you already see the pattern? White takes back, and now there is a beautiful move. I'm not sure if you actually saw it, but Naroditsky did queen a4, sacrificing his queen. Because if you would take, there's a checkmate on c3. Instead, white played queen c1, and now another amazing move. This queen doesn't want to be in the game at all, clearly, because queen d8, and if you would take, then there is a checkmate again. So that's not what white did. White played a3, opening up some room for the king, and now you simply take the pawn on c3, because this queen is still pinned. The king comes forward and there's a checkmate on b3. Unbelievable. What a game.
Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe. We're out of here. Bye.